Guys, it's that time. I got my motor in. We're gonna swap it in today. I'm gonna go over exactly how to do it, and I'm gonna go over some of the specs with what we did with this motor, and we're gonna get this thing going right now. So the flywheel is super easy to go on. Pretty much all you want to do is there's a little notch right over here. Just match it up with the notch on your crank. Some cranks actually have a little dowel stuck in there, so that it's pretty simple and pretty easy. I actually do not. It's not a big deal. It's just easier just to locate the actual flywheel itself. And the bolts that I'm going to be using are not RB26 bolts, but RB25 ARP bolts. This specific flywheel is a little bit thinner. Again, it's an aftermarket flywheel, so they do tend to be significantly lighter. So they take off a little bit more material here. Exedi actually supplied me with thinner bolts, but I actually ended up giving those to a buddy of mine, and he awesome guy, Roshane. He actually got me a new set of bolts back when I was stuck. So you've got to make sure that you measure out the distances and make sure that you guys have the correct bolts. If you don't, you're gonna basically have a super loose flywheel, and you're gonna have a crap ton of noise coming from your transmission. So make sure that you guys do choose the right bolts. You can measure them out and make sure that you have the right ones. But yeah, pretty much we're just gonna get all the bolts all in here and then get it torqued down, and I'll show you guys how to do that. So one of the nice things with ARP hardware is they give you all of the torque specs and exactly how these things go on. What you want to do is you want to use their assembly loop and put a little bit of the actual assembly loop right just at the head of the actual bolt itself. And then you want to use 242, which is usually pretty much the blue Loctite on the threads. If you use the red stuff, I mean, your bolts are going to be pretty difficult to come out, but you want to use the blue stuff in this case. And they say they torque it down to 95 foot-pounds. And I'm going to show you guys how to put that all together there. So I just want to get everything started by hand first. So we're just going to set our torque wrench at 95 foot-pounds and get this all torqued down. The nice thing about having a digital torque wrench is you can actually see how much torque you're actually applying. There we go. So we're just going to repeat that whole process for all of the other bolts. So when you're putting a twin disc flywheel and clutch kit together, you're going to find these super small, they're almost like locator springs, and they have a certain area. There's like an indent on the actual flywheel that they'll go into. So just make sure that you're watching for that when you put these together, or else it almost puts on a little bit of preload on the actual pressure plate itself, and then that way it can reduce a lot of that additional clutch and twin disc noise that most twin discs get, because they end up literally, imagine a twin disc, you've got two plates side by side, and whenever there's no pressure on the plate, the clutches will just chatter. But what these specific springs allow you to do is it attempts to almost reduce that chatter, so the discs don't float around like this. It adds a little bit of preload on each one of the discs. Not enough preload, obviously, so that your clutch doesn't grab anymore, but just enough preload so that it doesn't cause that vibration. So there we have it. Everything's being torqued down. So basically, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. that's how I chose to do it. You can also follow Exetti's diagram, which is the exactly same thing. It just goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, same way. You want to use a star pattern when you're doing this. When you're putting the flywheel on as well, you also want to check for that this key moves freely, and that the plates and everything are all lined up, and everything should be all seated by now. So for those of you guys that are looking to do this swap, you can do this with the stock cross member, but I actually ended up going with the Apex engineered cross member and their RB25 transmission mount. So basically the motor just drops right in and bolts, and the transmission bolts in. But what you have to do, I don't know if you guys can see this from here, you actually have to cut away the old transmission mount. That actually comes in the way of the transmission and you can't actually push it up. The transmission itself gets held on basically by that mount there. I know probably by the time that this video is out, Apex Engineering has a whole new version of this mount, but pretty much the transmission itself gets bolted on through that. I found it easier just to put the transmission in after, so get the motor itself snugged in and then get the transmission put in after. So pretty much I've got the motor itself just attached to the engine hoist using just some brackets I had kicking around, just at the front and the rear. I've also seen people attach it directly to the coil cover or the coil bracket over here. That way it keeps the motor totally stable. The motor itself pretty much is just going to slide right in. I'm gonna have to remove this strut tower strut bar, and then I've got the car jacked up and I've got a jack underneath the transmission so we can wiggle everything in place. You've got to be a little careful when you're doing that. There are a couple sensors down the transmission, speed sensor, reverse sensor, things like that, that could get caught, and you could actually potentially do some major damage to them. So don't jack it up too high. Other than that, I mean, it's just going to slip right in. So what was found, I mean, when you're moving an engine, you don't really need to get it 20 feet in the air, but just double check it all, make sure it's all super tight and sturdy. Have it once over your hoist and we'll push it into place. So pretty much got the engine in its place. Now it's pretty much the toughest part, which is trying to get everything shimmed together. Again, you want to make sure that you're using the correct kind of hardware to lock everything in place. You want to make sure everything is super tight, and it's so that it can't slip off one of these chains. I've seen a lot of people use seat belts, things like that. I'm not a big fan. After a few years, a lot of times seat belts, they tend to become brittle. A chain is always the way to go, especially when you have something, you know, so expensive. You don't want it to break. I go any deeper, I noticed that this is going to be super inaccessible. So what we'll do is we'll just make the hose right now real quick. Super easy to make AN hose. Basically take you gotta cut your hose. What I always like to do is put a little piece of tape, cut it straight, and then take apart your AN fitting itself. And I always just add a little bit of lube, 3-in-1 oil, ATF, something like that. You don't need a lot, just a tiny bit. And just thread this on. You'll notice that it starts to bottom out on the inside, and when it's completely bottomed out, you know you're good to go. I always find that like thicker hose is always easier to build compared to like the thinner stuff. Maybe it's just easier to grab a hold of. I do have a vise, but getting it all set up is just crazy right now just to do one little hose. So this guy pretty much just goes in like that. Thread it in by hand. Okay. And obviously I'm not going to leave this like this, so third time's the charm. Okay, that's kind of big, but we'll just make it work. You guys can see I'm using aluminum AN wrenches. Aluminum, when you use aluminum on aluminum, it doesn't scratch the actual anodized surface as easily as it would if you use like a steel wrench. I mean, in this case, I'm kind of stuck using one of each, but what we'll do now is we've got one hose end made. There we go. So we'll just route that for now, leave it just kind of loose, and I'll work on putting the rest of the motor in. So the way that I usually do this is I try to get at least one bolt started, and that'll allow you to pull the motor together. Since again, like I said, the RB sits on a weird angle, so you just want to slowly get a bolt started, and then what will happen is the dowels and everything will pull themselves in, and it'll lock itself in place. Look at this side. Wow, that actually is going in super smooth. Good. So I've got everything all mocked up, but I'm just gonna add a little bit of Loctite on the inside because we're not really using the old school, really, you know, a lot of rubber bushings. It's just one rubber bushing and the rest of it's all metal. So I found when I was actually taking apart the last motor, when we pulled it, that some of these backed off a tiny bit. So obviously we don't want that happening, especially with the amount of power that we're going to be going with. So always a good idea, add some Loctite. All right. Sand these guys down. Okay. All right, there you have it. The RB is installed. The motor's all dropped in. Next thing that I'll probably start tackling is all the wiring harness and pretty much get this thing to crank over. And then after that, we're going to start looking at mocking up where this turbo is going to sit, because this thing is freaking huge. And then put the cam covers back on and pretty much take it from there.